Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, August 22nd in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism against people in foreign countries, encouraged sotto voce by our government as an excuse, not the reason, for the wars. At this moment, the U.S. is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world? Not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran. The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. AWARE was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan on 7 October 2001, which began America's longest war. Barack Obama was the first U.S. president in history to have been at war all the way through 2 presidential terms. And as we heard last night, the war in Afghanistan will continue and apparently be expanded. The founders of AWARE saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over economic rivals from Germany to China. Since World War II, U.S. presidents have killed between 20 and 30 million people for the profits of the American economic elite. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph for the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, call upon President Trump to 1. Establish foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. 2. End the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, and stop the drone attacks. 3. Cut military spending by at least 50%. And close the more than 700 foreign military bases. Russia has 15. China has 1. Bring U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into more than 170 of the world's countries. 4. Stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5. Lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, particularly after President Trump's speech last night, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by the pro-war U.S. political establishment. We'll try to give a better account tonight, and we'll begin with David Green.
Well, I'm just going to raise a few questions and make, insofar as I'm involved in this, I just want to make a few points, and I think you'll probably have some things to say and maybe have this more free-flowing. The way I've been following this event last night in which Trump redeclared war on Afghanistan for the umpteenth time, I read the New York Times accounts of his speech and the basically sort of insider politics aspect of it in terms of, well, first you get rid of Steve Bannon and you raise all these generals into this place of power where they're the only ones that Trump is listening to. Apparently, some of the people in the right-wing media I heard referred to are not at all happy, not surprisingly perhaps, about Trump's decision to try another surge into Afghanistan. I've been following most of the what I would call the perspective news or the alternative news through the Real News Network, and there we had an interview with Trita Parsi, the Iranian commentator who represents a think tank, a good quote unquote think tank, in analyzing the relationship of the United States and the Middle East with Iran, which seems rather central. Paul Jay on the Real News Network had an ongoing live stream this morning, which is now up. It's over, but you can just simply, of course, watch it. About a 40-minute interview with Phyllis Bennis, talking about giving background for Afghanistan, the players involved, the role of the Taliban over the years, the warlords in and out of power, the suffering of the Afghan people, which nobody cares about, and which, of course, least of all, our government cares about. And there was also an interview that Charmony Pires on the Real News Network did with a guy named Matthew Ho, H-O-H,
Yes.
who was a diplomat in Afghanistan for some time and resigned from that because he understood too well what was going on. And he emphasizes the role of the military-industrial complex, the Washington area, military defense contractors, think tanks, who are all just so vested in maintaining the conflict in Afghanistan. You've got to consider that along this sort of inertia that we have after 16 years and really much longer, as Phyllis Bennis points out, really 40 years, nearly 40 years now of American involvement in Afghanistan, going back to the Carter-Brzezinski regime, bringing the Mujahideen, the Pakistani-based Islamic radicals to bear on Afghanistan in the 1980s during the Carter and then into the Reagan era, where it hit its peak and where the Soviet Union was dealt its Vietnam. One more thing I meant to mention in regards to what Phyllis Bennis was talking about is the role of the conflict of India and Pakistan,
Yes.
as it relates to what's going on in Afghanistan. Pretty scary stuff, considering you've got two nuclear powers here. And it was new to me to kind of have it referenced that with this tough talk that Trump gave last night against Pakistan relates to the conflicts that India has had over the long term with Pakistan in regards to Afghanistan, and are sort of raising the temperature somewhat in relation to siding with India in a sense in relation to India and Pakistan. I don't consider myself an authority on any of these issues, but they've all got it going on. But I guess to come back to the main issue that really keeps us in the Middle East, I think it remains, coming back to what Trita Parsi is talking about, getting tough on Iran seems to have become a dominant theme in the Trump presidency, and referring to the main point that you make at the start of this show and every show, it's basically the pipeline or the access between Tehran and Damascus, or even Beirut, that is really crucial strategically in terms of our presence presence in the Middle East. And sometimes Afghanistan might come to seem as a sideshow, but it's like we need to assert authority there. And where else are we gonna do it right now? I mean, we've sort of drawn down Syria a little bit. We've come to terms with Russia in Syria. So when the war party, as Justin Raimondo, and I probably should have read his column yesterday. I don't think I did. I'm not sure what he wrote about, but the war party has to get its war on.
Yep.
Where else to turn
Exactly.
at this point in time?
I think that's a vital point. When I finally read the text of Trump's speech last night, I couldn't bring myself to listen to it, obviously,
I
for
read it
obvious
also.
reasons.
Yeah.
But when we looked at the text, the one thing that jumped out at me as unusual, the rest of it was boilerplate, the rest of it was usual, the rest of it is is what's been going on all along. The thing that jumped out at me was the reference to South Asia, the reference to India. And this is important. I think the reason it's important, Trump said it several times. He said he's talking about our path forward in Afghanistan and South Asia. Well, South Asia is State Department speech for India, and you know that was unusual. Unless you realize that the way in which Afghanistan is being thought about by, you might call the permanent government, or if you like the deep state talk, that always sounds a little conspiratorial, but if we just talked about the way in which the American government has conducted affairs for more than a generation, we talk about that, what we see here is the emphasis on India shows that the primary focus of the United States killing in Afghanistan is not terrorism, it's China. What the U.S. is doing in Afghanistan is what the U.S. has done for really more than a century, trying to make sure that no economic integration of Eurasia occurs in such a way that it would threaten America's 1%, the American 1%'s worldwide economic control. It's the profits of the American 1% that depended on Asia, which was clear to American governments already by the end of the 19th century. If you want to read the history, go back and read about the open door policy of 1899 and what the U.S. was concerned about. The U.S. was concerned that other countries, the other imperial countries, the colonial countries, notably Germany, would organize the riches of Asia in a way that would exclude the American economic elite. That wasn't to happen. The door was to be open, in the American sense, to all colonial powers, Germany and America and Britain and France and so forth. The door to China was to be open to all these powers. No power was to slam the door in the face, notably of the United States. Now that in fact has been the American policy, as I say, for more than a century, and has led to other things, such as the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s. What the Second World War in the Pacific was about, from the United States' point of view, was to defeat the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which is what basically the Japanese imperial organization of Eurasia. That's not to happen. And the issue can be traced throughout literally generations of American foreign policy, literally generations of American war making, up to, including, by the way, Korea and Vietnam and so forth, up to the present. American presidents have killed, as I mentioned in the intro, between 20 and 30 million people since World War II, since the defeat of the Japanese attempt to do it. And the primary reason to do that is to maintain the disparity, as George Kennan said in a famous account of American policy in 1948, the disparity between the American control of the resources of Asia and the attempts by other peoples, including the native peoples, the domestic political forces in the region, to interfere with American control. All right, what we had last night was Donald Trump getting with the program. The fact of the matter is that Trump had become president but with critiques of American neoliberal and neoconservative policies, which themselves were manifestations of this long-term concern for no economic rivals in Asia. And that so upset the American ascendancy, the American political class, as you like, that they've moved heaven and earth to make sure that Trump gets with the program. Well, in fact, he has. That's what we heard last night. That's what the burden of his speech really was. We forget sometimes, or it's perhaps difficult to see, until a speech like that last night, the remarkable similarity between the Obama and Trump presidencies in regard to foreign policy. Everyone talks about Trump's character and contrasts it with the nice Mr. Obama, who, as I mentioned, also is the only American president to be at war through 2 presidential terms. But the fact of the matter is there is a remarkable similarity in regard to Afghanistan, in regard to a Eurasian war in the Obama and Trump presidencies. Obama was elected, you remember, as a peace candidate. He had the anti-war movement behind him because we didn't want all that nasty warfare that the global war on terrorism had brought to us, thanks to George Bush. So we elected Obama as president on the grounds that he would deal with this problem, move this war out of the way, specifically in regard to Afghanistan. Afghanistan was the center of the anti-war discussion in 2008 when Obama was running for president. When Obama got into office, the first thing he did, well, perhaps not the first thing he did, when Obama got into office, he sent literally thousands more American troops to Afghanistan. We fell into rather pointless discussions about whether Obama was consciously lying or simply falling in with the requirements of the job. It really didn't matter. That's what he did. He ran as an opponent of the war and in office expanded the war. He would go on to expand it even more with the drone assassinations and so forth, but still the pattern was clear. The point is to see that Trump did exactly the same thing. He ran against the war. He ran against the interventions. He ran against everything from the invasion of Iraq to the fighting in Syria. The U.S. Obama-supported jihadists in Syria. He ran against all those things. And then in office, as we heard last night, he did exactly what Obama did, planned to send thousands more troops to Afghanistan. Now, what we're dealing with here is less the personal psychology of these people. Obviously that's involved. We're dealing with the long-term American policy, which maintains itself regardless of what has to be said in order to get presidents elected. Obama got elected by running against the war. Trump, to an extent, got elected by running against the war. But their practice in office also turns out to be similar, even though it contradicts what they said in order to get into office. That's the lesson that we should draw from this, and we should realize that the only enemy that the American government fears is the American public, and therefore they have to keep lying to it. The only way it will change, the only way we'll stop killing people at the massive rate we are in Asia and elsewhere, is when the American public finally tells the political class, enough, no more war. We don't want that. Something like that happened in Vietnam, and the parallels between the government of South Vietnam and the government of Afghanistan are very great. And so the past is prologue. We should think about what needs to be done here.
I was thinking about what those parallels were for some reason, maybe because somebody brought that up, I'm not sure, these corrupt governments that we supported in South Vietnam.
Exactly.
But where's, the difference, of course, there's there's apparently no Ho Chi Minh in Afghanistan, or if there was a Ho Chi Minh, the Soviets, whoever the Soviets were supporting in the 1970s was already dispensed with during their time there, and our time basically fighting a proxy war with them there. I mean, we strangely succeeded in Afghanistan in dealing the Soviet Union the defeat in dealing them their Vietnam, but now it's like Afghanistan has become our second Vietnam.
Yep.
And it goes on because there's no unifying force, there's no sort of relentless secular force as there was under under Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong, and what we have is the Taliban and the warlords who are unable to really unite Afghanistan to resist the U.S. occupation there. It's a poor country. People are talking about, well, what does Afghanistan have that we want? And sometimes people say they've got the world's greatest deposits of lithium, which is something, I don't know, used in cell phones or whatever.
In the computer, right.
And back in Vietnam, they would talk about tungsten.
Right.
There's a couple
That's
other
right.
minerals.
I forgot that. You're quite right.
Yeah, and but in some way, these couldn't be determining factors
That's
in
right.
why
That's
we're
true.
in that area of the world, and why at this point in time we're choosing to re-up things here.
I think that's right.
But anyway, I mean, you can comment on that, but just let me raise another issue, which has to do with what is a reader of the New York Times to think? I mean, they're hating on Trump every day. And even I even saw a Rachel Maddow clip where she's talking about Afghanistan, not at all with the same tone of voice that she usually talks about Russiagate and Trump.
Right.
But the readers of the New York Times, the people who comment in the comment section, which I think are pretty typical comments of liberal readers who are writing because they hate on Trump. And they're writing in response to the New York Times measured assessment of what's going on here and what's with the generals and what's with Steve Bannon. They're basically saying, they're continuing their sort of tirade against Trump's incompetence and his cluelessness, and what it reveals on one hand is the fact that people are tired of war in a way that the New York Times editors are not tired of war.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
The people who just assume that a sensible, if you oppose Trump and you oppose everything he does, and then you've been having your doubts about these wars, and you didn't express them when Obama was in power because you thought, well, he was, Obama was just dealt a bad hand and he couldn't do anything and his hands were tied and whatever other cliche you want to use about that. But now the liberals' hands are untied to criticize Trump and to criticize war. And that's not what elites want. That's not what
they want to do.
So no, wait a minute. We were criticizing Trump about Charlottesville.
Exactly.
Trump has changed the subject, and that's another motive, perhaps, for why now, changing the subject from Charlottesville. It's a little bit superficial, but I think it's somewhat relevant in terms of timing. This whole Afghan surge has been in the pipeline for a really long time, but still, it's like the New York Times editors are going to have to revert to a different stance and say, now wait a minute, I know we've been hating on Trump every day in every way for the last 8 months, but now the adults are in the room, they're in charge, and they're giving us their sort of this sort of ridiculous that Trump started off with this. Well, it's not going to be a time-based assessment of Afghanistan. It's going to be an outcomes something based assessment. So we're not going to tell our enemies when we're leaving, because that's only giving them a clue as to how long they just have to wait us out for. I mean, it sounds intelligent, but of course it's completely silly. I mean, none of this is ever going to really, does it really means anything in terms of what we're actually doing there.
Yeah, I mean, amidst the suffering and pain and death and destruction that the U.S. government is causing around the world and the U.S. political class is responsible for, I must admit there's a certain amusement this morning or today about where the piggy of that class actually are in the media at the moment. Here they have been spending, as you pointed out, months saying Trump shouldn't be president, he's not capable of it, he's too stupid, he's crazy, he's clearly wrong on all these other sorts of things, he's dangerous, something must be done, get rid of the Constitution, throw him out, find some way to get rid of him and get someone in there who will operate the same policies that the previous administrations operated in the world at large. And then suddenly, Trump announces he's going to operate the same policies that the previous administrations have operated, and all these commentators on television and in the press are left with saying an embarrassment, a bit of egg on their face in regard to the incompetence of Trump, when Trump does what he was being forced to do by the American political establishment. He announces an expansion of the war in the Middle East. Now, what are they going to say? If they're consistent, they're going to say that Trump is incompetent as president, and therefore the expansion of the war in the Middle East is incompetent. But that's what they've been after all along. And so, you sharpen your pencil this morning as you sit down to work on the New York Times editorial, and you realize you've got some problems. You've got a quandary. Rachel Maddow must be scratching her head right now and thinking about, well, how do I find a way of saying that Trump is incompetent as a president and should be removed when he's just said he's going to do what it is we wanted him to do in the first place? So it's hey, got to have some sympathy for these poor people, right?
So I don't keep up with the Washington Post except through whatever editorials.
Except when you buy from Amazon, right?
Yeah, yeah. Which people have been slapping my hand for doing that, but I don't do that, but not because not really out of principle, really out of cheapness, but in any event, I haven't been keeping up with the Washington Post, as I was going to say, except through reading whatever columnists end up in the local newspaper. And I don't know if we're going to have to wait until Friday to see what Charles Krauthammer has to say about it. Do you have any? Have you?
I haven't seen it.
You haven't seen.
But he's someone else in the same problem. I mean, excoriating Trump, but now suddenly Trump is down with the program. What are we going to do?
And I guess maybe today's Tuesday, so tomorrow maybe Thomas Friedman in the New York Times will be weighing in on this, but they're probably giving them too many reasons to not impeach Trump, for these people to oppose
exactly
the impeachment of Trump, and then it's just going to be left for progressives. I saw on the ZNet website this morning that Marjorie Cohn, somebody I greatly respect,
National Lawyers Guild,
law professor out in California, who's usually she's speaking of sharpening her pencil. Speaking of sharpening pencils, she's busy figuring out how it's going to be legal to impeach Trump. Blah blah blah. When everybody knows, it seems to me, that whether or not he gets impeached will not be due to any technical legal factors of what case can be made against Trump. It's the political winds that are going to be blowing one way or the other within the Republican Party. And why even talk about this? Why even talk about impeachment when a majority, there's no indication that a Republican majority in Congress is going to vote to impeach Trump. But maybe we're getting too far afield from the aware theme.
On the contrary, I'm going to suggest that AWARE, for the first time, begins to support the impeachment of Trump.
Oh.
I'm in favor of the impeachment of Trump.
I just fell right into this.
Exactly.
How did I do that?
AWARE should be calling for the impeachment of Trump for the same reason AWARE historically called for the impeachment of Bush and for Obama, for fighting an illegal war. The wars that the Bush and Obama administration carried on were unconstitutional. Read the Constitution about who decides on going to war and what the president's role is in that, and you will see that, as people have been saying since I've started to say since the invasion of Iraq, but as far as that goes, since Bill Clinton's attack on Yugoslavia, American wars in recent years have all been unconstitutional because they've simply not followed the pattern set out, the legal requirements of the Constitution for the U.S. going to war. Okay, we've been able to finesse that because the political establishment wants those wars, regardless of the United Nations, regardless of the Constitution, and the wars have gone ahead. I'm perfectly happy now to support the movement to impeach Donald Trump on the grounds that he's violated the Constitution by killing people in the name of American wars, which are unconstitutional, which are not decided according to a constitutional pattern. Now, I don't expect to get too far on that, except for the fact, the point you were making a moment ago, that the American public is not behind these wars, and that the real war politics of all recent American administrations has been an attempt to coerce or cadge or cozen the American populace into supporting these presidential wars. Okay, they've been pretty successful on it. Maybe it's time to try to call them on it. Let's impeach Trump for for waging an unconstitutional war.
Yeah, and I wonder, what is? Yeah, here we have Charlottesville, and here we have this, and here we have the anti-fascist, the allegedly so-called anti-fascist left or anti-fascist movement against Trump, and the contrast between what happened in Charlottesville and, say, what's happening in Afghanistan. And they could, I suppose one can argue that, well, we've had this ongoing war in Afghanistan, and it's hard to even argue this is making a qualitative difference in what our involvement in Afghanistan.
Just more troops, you mean?
In the Middle East, yeah, just quantitative, more troops. Mm-hmm. Some fancy words to talk about what our goals are, and likely to amount to nothing but more suffering for the Afghan people, which, as Phyllis Bennis points out on the interview she did with The Real News, has the highest mortality rate of children by until the age of 1 of any country in the world. So, what is the left, the so-called left? Again, we could talk about alliances between the left and right. It seems like we wait more for the right, for the libertarian right, for the Ron Paul right, for the AntiWar.com right, to weigh in on these things, as opposed to the Antifa left, or the Bernie Sanders left, or whatever. Not that I don't equate those two things, but so.
No, but it is instructive and worthwhile to begin consideration of American political groups' response to the war, that Bernie Sanders supports what Trump is doing in the Middle East, and Ron Paul attacks it. Even Ron Paul's son, Rand Paul, sort of Ron Paul light, mm-hmm. Has been one of the few senators, practically the only senator, to speak out against the expansion of the war that Trump is talking about. So the politics of the matter are, sort of the domestic politics of the matter, are certainly confused, but it would be very worthwhile if we would sort out the real opposition to the executive wars that Trump has gone over to. And the beginning of that, I think, is to try to understand exactly what the United States government, and in this case I mean more than the president himself, what the United States government is actually doing in this area. And what the war in Afghanistan is actually doing, I think, is trying to drive a wedge between Russia and China. American foreign policy is not stupid, it's vicious. It's remarkably consistent. The American foreign policy mavens have learnt nothing and forgotten nothing, but their position has been clear, if, as I say, evil. And the position is to make sure that this consolidation of the Eurasian economy doesn't occur. The Afghanistan war, the expansion of the Afghanistan war, is directed in many ways against China. If you look at a map, you see that, in fact, China has a border with Afghanistan and the U.S. doesn't, but the Chinese-Russian coordination, which so frightens American policymakers, is threatened by American troops in Afghanistan. That's the real reason the U.S. wants to keep a military presence there. That is to discommode Russia and China. You mentioned earlier that Afghanistan was the scene of the attempt of the Carter administration to give Russia a Vietnam of their own, back to the parallel between Afghanistan and Vietnam, in the 1970s, when National Security Advisor Brzezinski gathered up the most fanatic fighters he could find, and in the most expensive CIA operation in history, sent them into Afghanistan in order to provide an attack on Russian hegemony in the region. That was before the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, and part of the reason for the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. So the issue of the U.S. killing people in Afghanistan today is bound up with this concern by American policymakers to prevent the success of the Russian-Chinese alliance and of the Chinese economic expansion, the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. There is a direct connection between the harassment of North Korea by the Trump administration and sending further troops into Afghanistan. And the connection is China. These are both designed to deal with the main rival of the U.S. economy and the world at large, which of course is China. And the Belt and Road Initiative, as it's called, the One Belt, One Road plan, the economic integration that China has been working so assiduously on during President Xi's term in office, is the direct form of the threat to American economic hegemony. And so for that very reason, the shift that we started talking about at the beginning of the program, that is the attempt to discommode Pakistan and to rely on India as a counter to Pakistan, grows out of the fact that Pakistan and China are working together closely on this expansion of Chinese economic connectiveness between Europe and Asia. The initiative runs through Pakistan, and the new hostility to Pakistan that Trump displayed last night is finally hostility to China, visited upon a ally of the United States, Pakistan, that seems to be getting far too close to China. So these geopolitical, if you like, considerations are uppermost in what's going on here. When the U.S. government says we're in Afghanistan in order to fight terrorists, that's about as that's the equivalent to say we're in South Vietnam we were in South Vietnam 50 years ago in order to fight communists. In neither case were communism or even terrorism really the rule. In both cases, and the reason that we can draw parallels between South Vietnam and Afghanistan 50 years apart, American depredations in those two countries 50 years apart, is that in each case what the U.S. was doing, what the U.S. is doing, is trying to make sure that the economic control that it once enjoyed in the region does not slip out of its hands. It's worthwhile working on that parallel. History doesn't repeat itself, as has been said, but it does rhyme. And the rhyme here is the government, as you said a moment ago, the corrupt government of South Vietnam and the corrupt government of Afghanistan today. Situations are never exactly parallel. But the policy of the United States involves those two countries at a 50-year remove in a remarkably similar way. And until we understand that, we won't understand why the American government insists upon maintaining what seems like a pointless killing regime in Afghanistan. The question, as I say, if you want an answer, go look at what the U.S. did in South Vietnam.
But lurking in the background is always Iran. And so what do we say about Iran? What Trita Parsi emphasized in his interview was that Iran is the power in the Middle East. It is the regional power in the Middle East. We attempt to deny the fact that Iran, just by its very nature, is going to be a kind of regional influence, a potential regional hegemon, and we approach that. And so Obama. So how do we understand the contrast, if there is, between Obama's Iran deal, Iran's nuclear deal, the ostensible opposition of Trump to that, or just wanting to find ways around that, or wanting to find ways to observe the nuclear deal and even observe that Iran is abiding by the nuclear deal or whatever, and other aspects of that deal, while at the same time continuing to demonize Iran in a way that Obama had, to a certain extent, stopped doing. What's going on here? What's going on with Trump and his advisors? What's the effect of Bannon leaving on that one way or the other? It gets very complicated because Bannon was identified with the Iranophobia aspect of forces, in spite of Bannon's desire to general dovishness in relation to either Afghanistan or North Korea. Apparently, he was intent on fighting Islam, fighting what he calls radical Islam, in relation to Iran's government. So this is perhaps the more localized dynamics of regardless of India and China and so forth. Well, you have India in its alliance, in a sense, with Israel, the Gulf states.
That's important.
Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. You have sort of that axis stretching across the Middle East, while at the same time you have Iran, Syria, Lebanon, or at least Hezbollah. How do these forces line up, and how does? I mean, again, Afghanistan seems to become a kind of sideshow to all this. And when you look at the enormity of these dynamics, you wonder what's the deal with Afghanistan.
I think the short answer about Iran, and there probably shouldn't be short answers here because in the old SDS motto, everything is connected, and the connections certainly show here. The short answer about Iran is that the difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration in regard to Iran are tactical, not strategic. By that I mean that the goal, the foreign policy goals, the military goals, the geopolitical goals of the two administrations, Obama and Trump, remain very much the same. They differ a little on what tactics will work to achieve those goals. The strategy is to control Middle East energy flows. The U.S. interest in the Middle East has always been about controlling those energy flows, but even that is not absolute, but rather a means to an end. You control energy flows in order to control the economies of countries that need that energy, notably China. The U.S. interest in the Middle East has always been an interest in regard to China. It takes us back to the point we started with, the American ascendancy's concern that no economic integration of Eurasia that threatens American interests takes place. One way to do that was by means of what the Pentagon has long called offshore control. Offshore control refers to control of the Chinese economy. How do we control the Chinese economy offshore? By controlling their access to energy resources, notably oil. Our colleague Karen Aram frequently points out that the energy used to light the lamps of Asia, as they say, passes through the Malacca Straits. That control of the sea routes, is vital for the energy imports that China needs. U.S. control of the flows of energy from the Middle East is the other end, so to speak, of that route. These things are all bound up together, and as a result, the U.S. sees the control of Iran, the major oil producer, as part of its general geopolitical strategy in this regard. No, the question is, how do you control Iran? Well, the U.S. 60 years ago said the easiest way to do it is to overthrow the Iranian government and put in a government that will do what we tell them to do, which is exactly what the CIA did in 1953 and established a government that followed Washington and Britain's bidding. Unfortunately for the planners in Washington, in 1980, the Iranians rose up and threw out that government and put in a government that was not willing to work for American interests, to fall in with the overall framework of order that Henry Kissinger talked about, that meant the oil flows from the Gulf, from the Middle East, would be under a general control by the United States. That's been this major goal of American policy all along. The Iranian unwillingness to do what they're told and to be happy with the government we found for them led to the conjunction of Iran with Russia and China. And the so-called Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the connection between Iran and Russia that saved the Damascus government. The U.S. is looking for many ways to deal with that. Direct military assault is only one way. A treaty with Iran was another way. And that's what the Obama administration tried to do. The Iran deal in the Obama administration was sold to us on the grounds that it had to do with the fact that the Iranians were going to make a nuclear weapon and we couldn't let them do that. That was never the issue, as all sides actually recognized, even though that's the lie that the U.S. put around. What the U.S. was concerned about was whether Iran would be incorporated into this overall framework of order in the Middle East, and the notion that it could be done via treaty, that it could be done by agreement with the Iranian government, was the inspiration for the Iran deal in the Obama years. The question of their critics was, will this really happen? Will this indeed give the U.S. The control in an overall framework of order of Middle East energy resources? And on that point, the jury is still out, in part because there are forces within the U.S. that are trying to say, no, that's the wrong tactic. We have to have a direct military engagement with Iran, put them in their place. That's the only way in which we're going to make sure that our control is guaranteed. Other peoples in the American government say, and that's not only incredibly dangerous, it won't work, because Iran now does have the backing of Russia and China. So the question of Iran, I think you're quite right. The question of Iran is extremely important, but we have to see that there is a tactical dispute within the American government over how Iran should be handled.
Yeah, so just maybe to bring that home, to bring it home a little bit, as we used to say. So we have this anti-war, anti-racism effort that's almost 16 years old, coming on 16 years old.
Right.
And we're going to be at the farmers market on Saturday. It'll be a nice day, so you should, if you have any questions, you stop by, and we probably won't have any answers, but we'll have stuff you can read. And
I thought that's what we've been doing.
yeah, right. Anyway, so that's one thing just to put on the table out there,
Right.
and aware we have our work cut out for us, because on September 23rd we're having is it Saturday, September 23rd, we're having an anti-war teach-in
Right.
at Channing Murray. I think that would be 4 weeks from Saturday,
Right.
from this coming Saturday, in which we're supposedly going to explain to our public, such as it is, of what's going on and how to oppose these wars. We have this other anti-racist thing going on in this country, which is associated with what we call identity politics. And that's a problem in the era of Trump. It's become a heightened problem in the era of Trump, because the energy of so many people is being sort of transferred onto figuring out how to oppose hate, how to oppose. All of a sudden everybody's quoting the Southern Poverty Law Center, and even the Anti-Defamation League, the Zionist group, the Zionist hate group, that all of a sudden is back to being an anti-hate group in the era of Trump, although it's really probably playing both sides of the fence in that regard. But Abraham Foxman has gone on to greener pastures, and I'm not sure what's going on with all that. But in any way, it's all very confused, but people are expending an enormous amount of energy on opposing hate in this country.
Right.
And the anti-war, anti-racism effort wants that to be understood in the context of war, of capitalism, of poverty, and so forth, whereas even the anti-FA movement, the anti-fascist movement, is wanting to understand it in terms of a few hundred people, some people with their tiki torches and their shields, and around the whole issue of statues, and these are telling issues, and these are important issues to understand historically. I'll refer to the article that I think you passed around, exactly from June, by Adolph Reed.